Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to the last panel discussion here this evening after what's been a really invigorating day for everyone here. Our last topic is talking about water. Is the media biased? What we're going to do is, we have 4 speakers here who are going to give just opening statements about their view on this, and then I'm going to throw it open to the floor. We have with us Paul Murphy TD, who is a member of the Socialist Party and also involved in the Anti-Austerity Alliance. Professor Devereux from the Department of Sociology in UL. Ralph Riegel, who's the Southern correspondent with Irish independent newspapers, and Clarke, who's the UTV Midwestern correspondent. So I'm going to start and ask Eoin to make a few opening statements.
Thanks, Mary. The work I'm going to refer to today briefly comes from research that's been done here by the Power Discourse in Society Research Cluster. And this particular work has been undertaken by my colleague Martin Power, who's here, Amanda Heaney, and myself. We were interested in looking at the way in which the media explained or didn't explain the water protests in Ireland in the last while, and the study that we have engaged in, it looks at 1 year of media content, so it's quite extensive. It looks at all print, tabloid, broadsheet coverage. It looks at broadcast coverage of the issue, and the next leg of this, a very important aspect of it, is the other reality, of course, is what happens on Twitter in terms of different versions, competing versions of explanations in terms of the water protests. I suppose our reasons for doing this kind of research come from a concern really for looking at the way in which media professionals and media organisations behave in terms of explaining contentious issues in society. So more often than not, media content trundles along, but there are these fissures, there are these junctures where contentious issues come to be explained by the media. And often it's in the explanation of these contentious issues that we actually begin to see where the cracks actually lie, and we, I think, begin to see why media ownership matters, and indeed the ideological agendas that many media organisations actually have. So we see that in evidence. So we're particularly interested in the way in which the protest movement came to be characterised as the sinister fringe. And you see sort of competing versions of the world, this idea of everybody else, they are reasonable people. Michael Noonan was talking about reasonable people, lots of other politicians talking about reasonable people versus these very nasty, lefty, Marxist, Leninist, Sinn Féin, Socialist Party. I mean, it got comical in terms of who was being considered to be the sinister fringe, because indeed many of these groups on the left are in competition with one another, and indeed are quite argumentative amongst themselves as to their position versus vis-a-vis Irish society. There are lots of precedents for doing this kind of work. I mean, we can just go back to the 1980s and see the way in which the British media discredited workers who were striking in relation to the closing of the mining industries. If you go right back to the 1930s, there's a very famous example that Chomsky talks about, the Mohawk Valley project, where there was an attempt in the 1930s by the Remington Corporation to again discredit American workers who were part of the labour movement. And we were interested in this because we were curious about the way in which the issue was represented and whether it was being represented accurately. Some of the issues come up. I referred to these earlier this morning. I mean, we looked in the study at issues about source bias. Who are the media predominantly using in terms of explaining events such as water protests? And again, it's interesting that issues about how many people marched, the numbers, the figures. I myself and my colleagues, we've been on the streets protesting against the water charges, and we've been in situations where there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people protesting, and yet media organisations reported in the hundreds or the low thousands. So their reality and my reality are two very, very, very different things. So what was also interesting in the work is that we began to look at where this idea actually came from. And we traced it back to an interview that Leo Varadkar gave to News Talk. And he talked about there being a very sinister fringe to some of the water protests. They abuse the Gardaí, they break the law, they engage in violence, and also they spread all sorts of information. And I'm worried that it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt. And there's a slight nod to the idea that there are people protesting legitimately, but the overwhelming emphasis is on this is, the fault of Sinn Féin, populist groups, left-wing groups, and so on. We're fomenting rebellion and so on. When then we looked at the coverage, it was very interesting to look at the fact that the idea of the sinister fringe was regularly replicated unproblematically. So it was just taken as a given that in the water protest movement there are sinister elements. And there are plenty of examples in our study of where you have versions that counter that, but it is striking to see many instances where the term sinister fringe is taken as a given. So there's a lack of counter-narrative. These issues matter. If we talk about fourth estate, if we talk about journalism in terms of the normative expectations about the role of journalism in a healthy democracy and so on, it really, really matters that journalists, across titles, across different media, it really matters that they report on issues accurately, that they give two sides of the story, that they don't all rush to suggest that if there are people complaining about austerity, or property charges, or water charges, that they're all somehow, quote-unquote, some part of the loony left, right? I don't believe in the loony left, but it's a phrase that they might actually use. So we looked at the way in which the political elite, Fine Gael in particular, Irish Water, how certain language emerges from press releases from Irish Water, the kinds of statements that politicians make, and particularly after the alleged kidnapping of a minister, you suddenly hear all of this focus on reasonable people, most reasonable people. And I'm hazarding a guess here, but it looks to me like the politicians were very, very much on message in the 7 to 10 days following that in terms of explaining what was going on. So the work looks at the representations in a lot of detail. I'm happy to talk later on and answer any questions about it. And my colleague Martin Power brought some copies of the study if people want to take that away. And if we run out of copies, like the loaves and fishes or not, we will certainly be happy to email you a copy of the study. Thank you.
Thank you. Ralph, would you like to go next?
Okay, I'll just probably give a little bit of background about myself so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm the Southern correspondent for the Irish Independent. I'm based in Cork and I work for the Independent, I work for the Herald, I work for the Sunday Independent, and I also cover for Independent.ie. Now, there were some interesting points I have to say in the study. It seems to describe a very different type of journalism to the one that I'm used to. And I suppose to explain why, the very first water charge protest that I covered was in 2011, and that was the Ballyhay Says No in North Cork. I've covered water charge protests all over Cork City, Cork County, Waterford, Tipperary. I've covered court cases relating to various water charges issues in the district court in about 4 different venues. I've interviewed multiple people in terms of austerity. If you want to broaden it beyond the simple water charges protest and get it to, say, indebtedness, evictions, I've covered the Eden House, we're familiar with that, it's the kind of the Cork version of Tyrrellstown, of evictions linked to receivers putting people out of their homes. I've covered that. I've covered stories in relation to self-harm and suicide in relation to indebtedness. I suppose bringing it back to the water charges protest and the water charges campaign, the professor there has described something that I simply don't recognise. Simple as that. I work with the Independent, and the only 2 issues that we have got as a directive from my news desk in relation to water charge coverage is number 1, I have to be very careful in referring to the health aspects of the metering box. Because if we did that, apparently there's going to be some defamation issues arising on the basis of whatever radiation or whatever measurement things were being used in it, that it could pose a public health issue. And the second thing was that in covering water charge protests, I had to be very careful in terms of referring to people who are already the subject of ongoing court proceedings. That's it. No. No one has ever said to me, you can't write this, you can't write that. I can put my hand on my heart and say, not only did I never use the words or the phrase sinister fringe, and as you can see, anything to do with hair descriptions are not exactly the kind of things I'm generally in favour of, not being Goldilocks anymore. I've never used the word sinister fringe. In fairness, and the funny part is I'm pretty much on first name terms with most of the water charge protesters at this stage in Cork, because I meet them at most things. And if anybody wants to kind of take it beyond that in terms of, you know, referring to the so-called loony left, I kind of consider Mick Barry a friend of mine at this stage. When I was doing the profile of Cork North Central for the general election, it was actually Mick Barry of the Anti-Austerity Alliance that I did it on. It was entirely my choice. I could pick whoever I wanted to do it on. I just thought Mick was the most interesting character. And I probably shouldn't refer to this with Paul sitting beside me, but Paul at a press conference in Cork, and there were 2 reporters at it. I was one, and I wasn't invited. But he forgave me afterwards for brigade crashing. So that's pretty much it. I mean, I was doing a little bit of research before I sat down here today in terms of media bias, specifically about the Irish water issue. And there's some very interesting blogs online, and one of the pities is that a certain academic wrote a blog about the bias within the media in terms of the Irish water coverage. He's not here now, I'm told he's gone, which is a pity because I would have enjoyed talking to him afterwards. And he raised an awful lot of issues, and the thing that crossed my mind was, it was very informed and very well argued, but there showed a total disconnect to how the media works in this country.